The ISS is the most expensive house ever built in the most extreme environmental. Ever know a $1 trillion mega project constructed across 3 continents over 2 decades and placed in orbit high above the Earth. Looking back from where we stand today, it's almost unfathomable what's a thing like this actually happened. It's a floating momentum to a fleeting momentum in time, where world peace seems so close that we could just reach out and touch it, but that time is gone, and pretty soon the International Space Station will be gone as well, so there's no better time than now before we forget to remember how the world once came together to build the most incredible symbol of the corporation. The first thing you need to know about the ISS is that it's really one space station. It's true, and the process of bringing these two sides together, worlds span multiple decades, global conflicts, and the collapse of the once great superpower. It's that late 1980s, the Soviet Union has built the first ever modular space station, a group of interconnected structures that from a habitable platform is low Earth orbit. There were Soviet men and women living and working in space for weeks and months at a time, conducting research and experiments that has expanding humanity's knowledge and cosmos. They call the station mere now few different English interpretations of the word mirror. Can't mean world community or village, but it also simply means peace. Meanwhile, the Americans as a space shuttle, it's a very expensive machine that can fly to space and do amazing things, but it's code. Nowhere to go, American astronauts simplify, go up and they come back down again. The Americans, but also have a plan, and they call in the Freedom Space Station bigger and more advanced than with the American Space Station, the first called up by President Ronald Reagan in the earlier 1980s. Constructions of Freedom should have been underway by the end of the Reagan's terms in 1989, but as the decades drew to a close, there are little to no progress to speak of, and the same time as all of these one of the most significant events in the history and talking space, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Now we'll skip over a few years of the turmoil as the old Soviet Union disclosed and the nation Russia has reborn into what's new now today. By the year 1993, the American and Russian governments were talking seriously about cooperation. The headset of the Cold War had been burned and replaced an olive branch of community East and West working together from the Berman and all humankind. It didn't hurt, and the Russians and inherited fully floating space station, and the Americans still very much wanted to build a space station. But at the same point, they had to admit to themselves that they just could do this on our own. The US government invited Russia to become a full partner in a new program of the International Space Station. Step 1 could be opened up near to the American process. In 1995, the space shuttle docked to the Russian space station. First time astronauts and the cosmonauts worked together in the scientific investigation and medical studies in the space as a symbol of peace, of unity, and huge but more practical standpoint. This was beginning of an opportunity for NASA and quickly learn as much as they would about the space station work, and they try to figure out if they could replicate the technology. Short answer that was no couldn't, or the latest they it couldn't be done in the reasonable amount of time, or the reasonable amount of money of American soil and other hand of the Soviet Union's already been well into the process and the planning of MIR too. They already had the industry and infrastructure in the place from the first time MIR constructions, and they even built a new core module, but the whole thing in the death and the rebirth and the genetic nation and left Russian little short on cash. So here is the deal that was struck. American would pay Russia to build the core of MER-2 and the Zera containing the power propulsion of the lift support system. Beating heart of the new space station would be manufactured in Russia using Soviet Union technology. Now it's important to make that between Russian and Soviet Union because much of the Soviet space program was engineered by ethnic Ukrainians and other smaller nations that were themselves behind the Orion curtain, the Dospoder and the redraw in 90s. Russians end up with the lossless access to the Soviet resources. So half of the ISS, actually the most important half, will initially be controlled by Russia, yet owned by the NASA, USA, and other half will be collected effort between NASA and their closest partner American will build two core modules, Unity and Density, while the European and Japanese space agencies will each contribute their own research, laboratories, columns, and Kaibo and Canadians. They built and the arms means stored in the Russian. This was the first to build by a pretty wide mega. Actually, this was a module originally constructed for MIR-2 that Russia had inherited from their Soviet producers. Work on Zyza began and Korvan Design Bureau in Moscow in 1984, and by 1986 it was pretty much complete after the module was put into shortage, where it would wait for 14 years before being called into action for the ISS. Either does into important jobs in the space station. Number one of the private life sports and system. Regulate the temperature, pressure, and humidity of the space station environment by system. Also generate oxygen from recycled wastewater. Number into the propulsion plays a critical role in the maintaining an orbit. By operation of the space station, it is fitted into orbit. Corporation engines they prevent the ISS from falling down into Earth gravity. And there are 32 smaller thrusters that control the exact position of the station. First module of the ISS to be launched into space, and the Russians remains Sunrise. There was a construction project founded by the USA but manufactured by Russian contractors in Moscow, which cut the price in half compared to made an American option construction from Zarya took place from the December 1994 to January 1998. Also at the same facility where MIR had been built a decade from Zarian, launched on November 20, 1998. At the top of Proton K rocket by the Binord Cosmodrome in the Kazakhstan, this event marked the beginning of the new era in space exploration or transportation from Cold War competition. The Peaceful Corporation, after 16 days spent alone in a space area, they made the first American module of the ISS. Unity, this design also has roots in the mid-1980s and the American modules. They were conceived as part of the Reagan's Freedom Stationing and a Unity module and constructed between 1994 and 1997. As begin, Boeing manufactured facility and the NASA Marshall Law Space Flight Center in the Alabama show its name. Unity will function as a control hub. Distribution resources throughout the space station. Unity contains 200 gas. They will American side Boeing. There are space shuttle. So that this time, I hope you enjoy this video.